Um, well, ladies and gentlemen, actually, we're going to allow Jason to allow his presentation to go forward as it should. There's a bit of a theme this afternoon, loosely anyway. A few of us UGA students are here. I thought Rebecca did a great job, very impressive. And our next speaker, I'm sure, will be equally impressive. It's my pleasure to introduce our friend in UGA Linguistics, Jason Hagler.
Hi. So I'm looking at language revitalization in the long term, and also language revival in the long term. And so what I'm concerned with primarily is once you've decided, okay, we're going to try to bring this language either back from extinction or back from the brink, what now? How do you actually make this viable for the next 50, the next 100, next 150 years? Because sure, we can get a whole bunch of 5-year-olds in a classroom, repeating back and forth animal names, colors, and even simple sentences in any given language. But unless they keep using it as they grow up, and they teach their children, we haven't done anything. And to take the sort of very negative view of humans, sure, they're great in the short-term social push, but they do kind of have trouble with the follow-through, kind of like me and my relationships. That was a joke. That was a joke. And so kind of what I'm going to do is sort of play the doom and gloom aspect of everything, kind of assume all that. So, if you've done a presentation on this, I'm not picking at you. I'm just being grumpy and saturnine and all that kind of thing. So, the identity and social linguistic politics are ridiculously complex. The dynamic and history of any given group varies wildly. It's not the subject of this work. There's so many issues about who gets to speak for any group, who gets to make policy for any given group, who even gets to talk about a group or study the language. It's so complex, and it all ties into in-group, out-group concepts of indigeneity, shared experience. They're all great topics. They're all really important, but they're totally not what I'm talking about. And in fact, the usual assumption of a higher power or a privileged class or a center and a periphery or core periphery kind of colonial dialectic is actually not even an issue here, because both Manchu and Akkadian are languages that went extinct despite being the language of the ruling class and actually being privileged. So in the case of Manchurian, during the Qing dynasty, the government was Manchu, and a lot of them have Manchu names, like Nurhaci from Indiana Jones, of course. But they actually wanted their officials to be able to speak Manchu, and within 2 centuries they couldn't find anyone who spoke Manchu. And so you've got memoranda from the imperial city and the imperial service, which had designed its entire operation to promote Manchurian identity. They can't find anyone. And actually, the whole stereotypical Chinese hairdo, where they're shaved in front and they got the long braid in the back, that's not Chinese at all. That is Manchurian. And in 1644, when Nurhaci comes in with the Manchu hordes, they institute a policy of creating Manchurianization. So, they say, shave your hair, because, Chinese men used to have long, flowing, beautiful hair. I kid you not. And then they made him shave it, otherwise they'd chop off your head. So, the Manchus were not afraid to go and mess around with things and get it set up the way that they wanted, but they still lost their language. So, I'm keeping track of things like that as well. So, what I think really people need to ask is, what for? You're going to revive this language, well, what for? And I'm not saying, why would you want to revive a language? I mean, what is your goal in doing this? Do you want this to be a liturgical language? Do you want this to be a language that people on the street are using when they're talking to each other? Is this a language for speaking at home? Is this a language that you want to have your legally binding documents in? And getting that figured out, I think, is critical for the success of any project. And for the most part, this is not something that people are talking about. It's a big, scary topic that requires the community to make a very firm decision. So first off, we got to figure out how healthy a language is. And needless to say, that is really, 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 really difficult. And there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. And I kept myself up, I cannot tell you how many nights trying to come up with a statistical model of projecting language health. And I'm sure it can be done, but, you know, that's perhaps your contribution. This is a dialogue. So you can measure it with public displays. You know, is it on street signs? Is it on the internet? Stuff like, you know, are you hearing it on the street? Problem is that sometimes you'll get conspicuous usages or usages to display identity. So if you're on the internet and someone writes their Facebook prologue, intro, or personal information in the language, well, are they doing that to display, hey, look, I'm X, I can use X language. You know, look at how authentically X I am. You know, again, if you're using it in these very public places, it might actually indicate less usage than it might otherwise. If we look at the sort of the Plattdeutsch example, you know, if you're very publicly going out of your way to, you know, be speaking Plattdeutsch all the time, you know, do you actually speak it at home? Maybe not. Also, you got to keep in mind usage domains. So, language of the home, language of an academic conference. You know, it's a very, very layered and complex thing. So it's kind of got these discourse bindings to it that we need to track. Because it's very good if the language is spoken at schools, but if nobody speaks it at home, that's a problem. Then you also have to keep track of how many speakers it has. And previous accounts have tended to focus just on the raw number. We're starting to realize, no, wait, we need to keep track of the age demographics associated with speaking. And so, anyway, point being, very complicated. So how do we deal with, or how can we look at models of multilingual interaction? And so I was up watching Sergio Leone movies. And so I kind of came up with 3 sort of paradigmatic case studies. So India, right? Many, many, many languages. Historically, it's been pluricentric. You know, really the British created India, despite what Hindu nationalists will tell you. And so historically, India has been separated north and south. You've had long periods of disunity. You know, even the sort of classic United India dynasties never ruled over the whole thing. It's just a large cultural region that, as an artifact of colonization, we think of as a single place. So in the Indian constitution, they've got Hindi and English, or English actually has no official status, I don't think. But there's 22 additional languages beyond Hindi that are Schedule 8 in their constitution. So they're entitled to federal support, and people can take their exams in them. And you can also do government work in them. So these are languages like Tamil, Malayalam, Marathi, Urdu, you know, the list goes on and on and on. Now, the working language tends to be English, government-wise. I mean, government working language tends to be English, because what you have are 3 sets of regions. Because each region or each state equivalent in India can choose which official language it uses. So, like Uttar Pradesh might be a region A. You know, their official language might be Hindi, and they choose to use Hindi in their official communications with the central government. Someplace like Tamil Nadu would be a region C, where their official language is Tamil, or Tamil, I think is how you pronounce it. But because nobody in Delhi speaks Tamil, they write all of their official correspondence in English. So what you have and then also the educational languages vary. So, for example, again, down in Tamil Nadu, like Hindi, what? No. And so they teach English and Tamil. Whereas in like, I guess, Assam and Bengal, you're gonna get Assamese and Bengali as the languages in schools. And they may or may not teach Hindi depending on how they feel at the time. But everyone learns English. So what you have are distinct regional markets and distinct regional poles of power with distinct regional languages that you have public support for at all levels. and there is no one language that predominates. While technically Hindi is a national language, you can get by perfectly fine without speaking a word of Hindi. And in fact, you can get to an arbitrarily high position of political or economic power without speaking Hindi, and it doesn't really hinder you. Pun there. We're also seeing regional cinema. Like, every state in India has its own cinema. So everyone knows about Bollywood, but there's also Mollywood and Tollywood and, Rollywood and Bollywood again, but like Bengali Bollywood stuff. So you have cultural works being produced in these languages, so there's not even all that strong of a pull towards the center going on. So China, on the other, so you can have multilingual societies where there is not much in the way of attrition one way or the other. China is a interesting case. There's 56 officially recognized ethnicities. Officially in the constitution, they are all equal. All of the languages are also designed to be viable in the long term, according to the Chinese constitution. Now, China has a really, really interesting history with all of this, and they're standardized under the communist, tongue-tied. So in the early days of the Communist Party, right after the revolution was complete, what you had were field linguists being sent out to each of these recognized ethnicities to come up with a writing system for the language, standardize it, get it written, get it ready, teach it. And so what you actually have are some really nice things where every single one of these ethnic languages has a dedicated writing system that's designed to serve the needs of the entire community. And by and large, they actually did a pretty decent job of it, as opposed to the Soviets. So, for example, Miao, Yao, other languages that I'm not thinking of, Mongolian, they all have dedicated writing systems now. You can take your exams in them. Okay, well, this got interesting. The catch is that because they're mapping ethnicity and language, Mandarin is the official language of all the Han Chinese, which is how they get you, because there's a whole bunch of dialects, which are really, really different. So, historically largely united, fewer market centers. You're having minority language policy, which is supposed to support minority languages with mixed results, because you're having language attrition just because there's so many goddamn Chinese people, Han Chinese people, who speak Mandarin. So you can't get very far if you only speak Songrongra, or whatever. You can't do it. Maryland, on the other hand, is a rather interesting mixed language scenario. You've got lots of immigrants. My hometown, I think, is like 30% Chinese. You go down streets, all the signs are in Chinese. Lots of Koreans, lots of Hindi groups. They all have cultural schools. And by and large, they're doing okay because they have cultural media in those languages. There's a cultural push, but you're seeing a fair bit of attrition in sort of an apathy kind of thing, like, yeah, when I was young, I spoke Chinese, and then I started responding to my parents in English. And so they kind of speak a child's Chinese, and they're not going to pass it on. Whereas other people are more likely to keep with it. And what it seems to be is that there's actually a market for Chinese, or Hindi, or Korean. And so there's community support. So the question is, why speak a language? You've got unintended consequences of providing political support. For example, I might argue that the push towards making it okay to speak Spanish in America actually is impinging upon native Latin American languages spoken by Latin American immigrants. Because if everything is available in Spanish, you're going to see increased attrition of Mayan and, Mesoamerican, that's not the right, Uto-Aztecan languages. So there's, gradations of just how dead a language is and how it's doing. Cantonese was an unofficial language. It's been suffering from attrition the whole time. But during the 80s, during the massive economic boom in southern China, you had people everywhere learning Cantonese. And then northern China kind of caught up in terms of economics, and people were like, whatever, Cantonese sounds silly. So there's obviously some gradation to all this. So the case study is Hebrew. Hebrew is the only language which is like full-on come back from the dead. It had a long history of coming back, starting in about the 18th century into the 19th century under the whole nationalist Zionist ideal. And so what you had was a period where people were like, well, the Hebrew race should speak their own indigenous language as opposed to the bastardized Creole Yiddish, which is a colonial language of the European oppressor. And so they would kind of, in Israel or Palestine, the British Mandate, because this is before the founding of Israel, you'd have settlers coming to go live in the Holy Land, and they would kind of go, Hebrew man, or so, Ivri, davar Ivrit. Basically, Hebrew, speak Hebrew. And so you had very intense social policing to make sure that people spoke this language. And you had this, what we would find a very creepy, nationalistic program of homogenization and power politics. And it happened at the expense of Yiddish. And what you had to do was you had to force people to speak this language, and if you didn't, they were shunned. And there was all this stuff back and forth. So, what do we have at our disposal as tools? Well, we've got physical space, we've got language classes. One of the most successful models is the community-run Punana Leo public kindergartens, or preschools in Hawaii. So it's Language Nest. And what they do is they get a bunch of volunteers and parents and stuff, and they all come in and they speak some Hawaiian, and the kids learn it and stuff. And that's great, but they don't necessarily have a follow-on program. But that's really great because you don't need money. You just need parents who speak the language. You've also got the internet, which makes it a lot easier to have this language being seen, putting it up there. So it actually removes some of the issues relating to physical proximity. Because, what do you do when you really care about preserving, say, Mohawk, but you don't want to live on the Mohawk Reservation? You're an engineer. You want to live in Silicon Valley. How do you get your children able to speak this language? Well, short answer is, well, you probably can't, but the internet helps with that. So there's some programs out there, some very nice, varying degrees of open sourceness kind of programs. You've got Anki, which is a space memory repetition flashcard system. Duolingo, which it actually builds word order. Only problem is that there's minimal grammar explanation. So I'm looking at Memrise as a way of doing that. It's totally open source, but the problem is that the quality of the content varies. Like, you've got the delightful Armenian Egyptian cognate deck, which there are no cognates. They're completely different languages. I was hoping Klein would be here because he would just facepalm. And then you've got all kinds of things for endangered languages, but most of them are straightforward vocabulary. So what we need is a way to teach grammar, and a way then to get people to keep using it, and a way to make it viable to use. And I think the way to do that is to ensure that there is cultural content being produced in that language. And honestly, I think it requires a community to say, okay, we want this language, and then they have to re-gear their entire society to making sure this language persists. So the point of doing some things that liberal, guitar strumming hippies aren't going to be okay with. And it kind of is uncomfortable to say, but in a lot of ways, language requires a hegemony. It's useful because everyone is speaking it, because everyone is on the same page. It's very much of an order kind of a thing. And people do tend to feel apathetic if they see other people taking care of something. Again, the only reason that Hebrew was able to come back was because you literally had, not like, I'm trying to think of a better, like 1984, the children would go out, kind of look and go, oh, that adult's not speaking Hebrew, kind of thing. And so, but I think that's really, based on the data, I think that's what you got to push for in a lot of ways. And so I guess I'm going to open it to questions here, because how do we go about this? And just actually one thought that I had was trying to get it so that the United States public schools in the States were teaching native languages as part of the national curriculum, because that would ensure that you had a large enough speaking population of these languages to be viable. And you can justify it through all kinds of cultural awareness, rewriting history or providing direct access to history, experiencing other cultures, things like that, trying to redress wrongs. But most critically, I think it would be an effective way of increasing the speaking population. So, I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, so your comment about 1984 style language education, that's a good idea, by the way. But they sort of do that. I've never done the program, but they sort of do that in the Middlebury program.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
The Middlebury program, as far as I know, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, you have to sign a contract saying that during whatever your time there, if you're doing Spanish or German, or whatever you happen to be doing, that speaking English is a kick-outable offense.
Yeah.
And if they catch you, I don't know if it's first offense or whatever, but you're gone. And that program has had enormous success with fluency. In fact, it's sort of the go-to program that I know of that people go to for fluency, real language fluency. And exactly that sort of, and I think students are encouraged to rat each other out. And in fact, to learn how to say rat out in whatever language they happen to be studying. So, sort of that, that seems more or less the kind of paradigm you want to look for.
Yeah, unfortunately, because I was in the language house at the University of Maryland, and we technically had to speak the language at all times, but we didn't.
Well, Middlebury's different. He's right.
Right. Like Middlebury,
Yeah.
they actually have penalties, and there's a culture of almost paranoia. Whereas, if you're kind of doing it informally, people don't.
But in Middlebury, they isolate you. You eat together.
Yeah.
You have the dorm. You're all the people of that language in the same dorm. They have dances. They have cooking classes. They have cinema. I mean, they really give you a whole lot of opportunities to interact in the language.
Which is just like how
my point, and Middlebury's great. I'm not knocking it, but I think if you're looking at this culture in the United States, which won't fund art, which won't fund music, how are you going to get them to fund Native American language
it
learning
improves
in
their
elementary
math
school?
scores.
I'm sorry?
It improves their math scores.
Oh, I know that. I mean, I know, I'm playing devil's advocate. I mean, if you can't get
Yeah.
an art teacher, the art teachers have to buy their own freaking supplies.
Yeah.
How are you gonna promote funding language teachers? Who's gonna pay them? Where are you gonna find them?
So I can answer a little bit of that.
Okay.
This doesn't have to do with indigenous languages. So about 5 years ago in Macon, Bibb County, which is a fairly large county, they
Yeah.
instituted mandatory Mandarin for every public school child in the city.
Wow, that's
So
impressive.
Who do you imagine funded that? The Chinese government.
The
funded
Chinese
that,
government,
right?
yeah, exactly.
So it didn't last very long because it was controversial and people wondering why Mandarin, but you could easily imagine if you had a funding source like the Cherokee Nation, for example, that had
Yeah.
those types of deep pockets, could easily fund a program that. I say easily, what I mean is if that were strategic.
Theoretically.
Right, exactly. So your answer is if you find someone who's invested enough in making sure that their language and cultural policy are.
And the interesting thing, when my nieces first started school here, elementary school here in Park County, they all learned American Sign Language. And I don't know, you probably know more of the school system here than I do, but where did that impetus come from? What was the supporting factor there? I thought it was a great idea. I mean,
I think we're skirting the really important and the really interesting question that he brings up, though.
which is what?
Well, why?
Why?
I mean, you can
Why?
force Big Brother style people to speak a language, but until there is some overarching cultural and/or social imperative to speak or use that language, some kind of prestige, some kind of reason to speak it, it's useless. And these are questions that are hard to ask.
They are.
Because we love language,
Yeah.
but it's got to be practical. You should say what you want to say.
Oh, no, these are answering my questions, actually. Because I had two of these questions written down, like to what extent does high school and college mandatory language learning actually affect people's, their first desire to learn, which we all know motivation is the most important, but second, their actual acquisition. Because people take linguistics
And
100
use.
to get out of Spanish too. So,
And used. You can learn a grammar, but it has to be used.
Right.
It's like a muscle. It's a simplistic analogy, but you've got to use that language, and it's got to be used in a contextually meaningful way.
Right.
And there has to be some reason to use it. It can't be collected like a merit badge. Well, if I studied French for 6 months, will I be fluent? No. How do you find a way to actually use it? That sort of thing, right? So he's asking really hard questions, and a corollary to that is, to what extent is it imperative to the retention of a culture, the use of the language? And I would argue there's a great, big, interesting Venn diagram there, but,
Yeah.
and this is huge with Spanish and Hispanic culture. Does it depend crucially on the use of Spanish?
But
I don't know.
I would actually argue from the historical data, no. It really doesn't at all,
And
because
that's right.
the Jews were quite successful in keeping their own culture, despite losing Hebrew.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is why do it? And until there is some imperative need to actually use language, there is no reason to do it, really. But if Dr. Busquet were here, he would get to how language death is a relation of what Warren-based sociological models call horizontal versus vertical axes, where larger government enforcement, language policies, et cetera, will add to rapid attrition and loss of the language. And he'll say if you do want to revive it, you have to make it important to the local community. Yeah. So you have to reinstitute, sorry Lindsay, you have to reinstitute horizontal axes where there's a need to communicate for some level, even if it's just within the community. But that's the rub.
I completely agree. But I have just two quick comments just for you.
Yeah.
Have you seen livemocha.com?
No.
Livemocha.com is language learning software. It's free. They support, I thought last time I looked, it was like 25 different languages, and they let you chat with native speakers. They put you through like regular worksheets, so you should check out livemocha.com. I was also going to ask, in a case like India, what does it actually do for us if we have sort of this big push culturally, governmentally, to classify language as something that we need? So like in India, where just in 2013 Malayalam was classified as a classical language, how does that actually help us? And if it is classified as a classical language and then we stop using it, do we actually need speakers for it to survive, right? I mean, what is our definition of survival? And then also, how do conlangs actually help or hurt Hebrew being that much? But those are things that we can wait for the break.
Well,
Just a couple of notes.
I mean, I'm the last talk before the break, right?
No, actually, apologies, Jason. We do have Lisa coming up.
My bad.
This is a natural point, isn't it? We should thank Jason for asking the hard questions. Jay Hagler, keeping it real, as we knew he would.
I do try.
Really real, really, really real.